faces here this morning. This week I'm kind of shooting around the state like a pool ball, just to give you a sense of the work that we do. I'll give some overview to start off with here. I've been with Lutheran Coalition for Public Policy since 1995. I graduated from Luther Seminary, and prior to that I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where I mastered in political science and also communications and education, which a lot of which is part of this work. My wife, I've been married 26 years now, also graduated from Luther and with an MDiv, and together we have 8 and 11-year-old sons, both adopted, and they keep us very busy. This particular week, I'll be going to, let me back up one more step. We're a partnership ministry, Lutheran Coalition for Public Policy. We're in our 25th year, and we'll be having our 25th celebration this December with all the bishops present from the ELCA. We relate directly to and are a partnership ministry with each of the 6 Minnesota synods of the ELCA. That's about 1,200 congregations. And right now our staff is myself. And so you might guess from that our work needs to be very focused, and what I like to say is the work I do is with force multipliers. And to use the term 1 + 1 = 3. If there's a group that always gets together, like if Jason says you're going to have 100 people or many people gathering on a weekly basis here that are interested and working on these topics through the work of your congregation, that's the place I want to be. And this week, for example, I'll be leaving right from here to go to the ELCA Camp Vermilion up near Cook, Minnesota on the Iron Range for a 2-day strategic planning retreat with their Caring for Creation Task Force. They're a group of clergy and lay leaders that are working throughout that synod to address issues of clean energy, environmental stewardship, the whole range of things. We'll touch on that here as part of our time. From that, I'll be going to the Pastors Theological Conference in Detroit Lakes, where I will meet with all the clergy of the synod, and the bishop will be there as well. After that, I meet with the Hunger Table for the synod, which works on all the hunger ministry with all the congregations in that synod. From there, I will go to Concordia College that same day and meet with the administration, the bishop's office, and members of that college, students and faculty, because we're planning an event with polar explorer Will Steger, and it's being sponsored by the synod, the college, and the Will Steger Foundation and Fresh Energy. There will also be, just for your information, I shared this with Jason, an event with Will Steger here at Marshall High School. Is it John Marshall? Thank you. At John Marshall High School in late November. That's not formally sponsored by us, but one that we want to get word out to you, which is, again, the type of thing we'll alert you to with our weekly or monthly addresses, depending on how busy things are. We don't send it out, anything to you, unless there's something we need to alert you to that might be of interest. Our office, it's helpful to start out, our office is funded as a partnership with each of the 6 synods. The other part of our funding comes primarily from ELCA World Hunger, and there's about a small sliver of their budget, about 9%, which goes towards education on hunger and poverty issues. That's part of what we're doing here, and advocacy, addressing root causes through policy. And so that's kind of how our office is funded. We're represented through you through a policy council that's reflected in each of the 6 synods, and in this synod, it's Pastor Ann Silverling, who is on our policy council. She's in the area, Grand Meadow, I believe.
We actually just accepted a call at Good Shepherd.
At Good Shepherd, yes. And we were on the phone this week, because I'll probably be speaking with the pastors' conference here before too long, and doing an update on a legislative session. And Pastor Larry Iverson, or not Pastor Iverson, he's such an astute theologian, I think of him as, but Larry Iverson is on our policy council. And together they really have served this synod very well. So the topic today, and it was really interesting, I don't have a PowerPoint, I'm not going to show a video. There are like 3 videos I could recommend showing in sound bites, but I'd rather have this be more a chance to dialogue with you, to hear what is of interest. I'll try to touch on a bunch of things and then invite you into a dialogue here. Seems that we're short of that nowadays. And I think we need to, in the faith community, serve as a leaven in this loaf what seems to have fallen at times. I'll give a few observations. First, I'm going to back up one more step here. We work on public policy, specific legislative issues at the state capitol, and my office is directly across the street from the state capitol. During the legislative session, I spend a lot of time back and forth to the capitol visiting with your elected leaders. And in the non-legislative session, when hopefully the snow is not flying, I travel around the state and relate very closely to the clergy and the congregations throughout the area. Lay a lot of the groundwork. On this table here, we have our policy agenda for 2012. And real quickly, our first issue is preserve a viable safety net, which is basically a floor through which we want people in our society not to fall below, a level of decency. Second, and those became very specific policies that we worked on during the legislative session. Second, we were monitoring the status and the impact of some proposed constitutional amendments that were drafted and did not go anywhere during the session, which would have impacted the way revenue in the state is raised. And the amendment that we were working on was not given a lot of attention, but actually had multiple bills at the Senate that were poised for action in the House on addressing the Constitution, the budget through the Constitution, and setting our budget at the state level. It's very complex. I don't know that we want to go there, but let's just say that there was strong support on both sides to not have that see the light of day and pass at the legislature. The third one was to defend clean energy policies. We've had a history with our office of working on environmental stewardship, clean energy policies. Anyone like dirty energy? Moving towards, and a lot of this policy that we worked on, I can touch on this more, was passed with largely in 2006 and 2007 at the state legislature. And those policies were passed on an overwhelming bipartisan nature. Governor Pawlenty led the charge on this. We had a state task force including utilities and a Lutheran bishop and faith community, evangelical faith leader, and many other folks that worked on this to look at how the state of Minnesota could reduce its emissions, pollution, and how they could do more efficiencies. What were the easy ways they could do that? And this led to things like a renewable electricity standard, things like biomass and wind and other forms of renewable energy. We're actually ahead in Minnesota now that we've passed the law and set these levels. We're ahead of our targets to moving of what the legislation actually calls for. We're exceeding those demands. We also established, yes?
Do you want to take questions at the end, or?
I'll take them a little bit further along. I want to provide the bulk of our time for back and forth here. The other piece was established firm reductions, the strongest in the United States, to reduce mercury from our coal-burning power plants. Now, we're the land of 10,000 lakes and the 10,000 fish advisories. I've got 8 and 11-year-old boys, and I know how much fish they can eat. And we've gone to the boundary waters, and we've gone fishing up in Brainerd and Baxter, and that's a concern, because the primary contributor to mercury is coal. And just an aside on that particular issue, that is an intersecting hunger issue. And it's a health issue. Mercury is a neurotoxin that bioaccumulates. So just to make the connection here, a lot of our work is to connect the dots. Fish is a major food source throughout the world. And the wind blows mercury wherever it will, not only in our 10,000 lakes, plus lakes, but also in other areas where people rely on fish as a food source. So addressing mercury and coal is not just an issue regarding climate change or reducing particulate matter in the atmosphere or health concerns related to that. It's also about food and food security. And those issues, if you can believe it, in 2007, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support to set the goals in Minnesota to reduce our carbon pollution by 80% by the year 2050. There are like 14 votes that people that voted against setting those goals for the state, and we've got a roadmap now to work towards that. So, that's right here, our policy priorities, and here is a summary which will be posted on our website. We're reformatting it right now, of the things that we actually accomplished during the legislative session. And I could get into the details real quick on that, but I'd like to talk more to the topic for today, which is about this soundbite world of politics that we're in and the dialogue. And I think, let me just give some examples. First, I'm going to start out with some Lutheran theology. In Martin Luther's, this is a great resource. It's called Lazarus at the Gate, Poverty and Wealth, Writings and Reflections. It's an ELCA resource. And there's a section in here on daily bread. Now, did you have communion at the last service here? This is going to be taking it a little bit to the sacramental perspective here. There's some great books that I'd like to commend to you. At the ELCA National Hunger Gathering in Detroit a couple of years ago, one of the keynotes was a professor out in Washington State called Samuel Torvin. He teaches there. Luther and the Hungry Poor, gathered fragments of his writings. I commend it to you. It's a wonderful book. And then another one, Daily Bread, Holy Meal, speaking about particularly the Leisnig order in the Lutheran Church in Germany at Luther's time, that when they had communion, they shared bread fragments as part of the communion, but they had all sorts of bread that was part of that service, and they opened up the doors and they fed the hungry poor. That was the flow from communion into the community, and this was how the ministries that took place that were both direct charity, but also let me read you Luther's, just some excerpts of his description of daily bread. Now our life requires not only food and clothing, in short, in everything that pertains to the regulation of both our domestic and our civil or political affairs. And then he goes on here. We ask us, the greatest need is to pray for all the civil authorities and government, for it is chiefly through them that God provides us daily bread and all the comforts of this life. Luther, when he took on, one of the things I did at Luther Seminary was go on a 2 Germanies trip, which was to study East and West Germany. This is before the wall came down, just before the wall came down. We saw a lot of the things that were leading to that. And to study Luther's writings and Luther's works there, and to study the confessing church in Germany, which was unsuccessful in addressing the Nazi regime of the time. But they were very active. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example. But when Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the church and state in Germany were like this. He was taking on the political systems of that day, the rulers directly, and he was a political exile who many wanted to burn at the stake, so to speak, at that time. And so we are a church of the Reformation, of reform. And so hearkening back to that tradition, as we engage both the charitable model, but also how we have our life in the public square. And I just commend this. I'm not going to go reading through this piece right here, but I wanted to highlight those 2 particular things. The Hunger Committee for this Southeast Synod right now, and I will say that the other Hunger Committees are working on the address that Samuel Torvin delivered at the Hunger Gathering in Detroit. And we're looking at that because they're providing a hunger training for the congregations throughout the Synod. And they'll be using, and they're meeting with Bishop Harold Isgard next month to go over this and have a text study about this Leisnig order and the role and the intersections of this faith in public life as a way of shaping our response to hunger and poverty. And by the way, it's going in the wrong direction if you've seen the new census figures. A lot of sidebars we could talk about there. But there is an alert on the table on the back here that just went out from the ELCA. Bishop Mark Hansen just wrote a letter in response to the new census data that shows the increase in hunger and poverty in this nation. And next week, we're going to be having the statistics specifically for Minnesota, which will drill down even further to look at those trends. But we're talking about the dramatic rise in the people needing food shelves and the reliance on the food banks and Channel 1. Scott Carpenter from that food bank is a member of the Hunger Committee for this Synod and very engaged in working with us on this. So, some observations. The theologian Karl Barth talked about when he preaches, and I'm not preaching this morning, but talking theology and the intersection. We talked about preaching as having the newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other. Now, if I were to take a Bible here, let me just show you two of them here. One of them here is called the Poverty and Justice Bible. You've heard about, you've got your red letter Bible that highlights all the things that Jesus says. Well, this one right here highlights all the sections that deal with hunger, poverty, and those themes. And let me just say that if you start cutting those out of here, you're going to have a really holy Bible because there's not a whole lot left. So so maybe you have this book in here and this in here. Or there's another Bible. I'll put these both on the table. It's helpful to read sometimes and just tweak the perception of how much this permeates Scripture. What we're talking about isn't some minor theme. This is called the Green Bible. And the Bible was written to an agrarian population, very connected to the land, sometimes very subsistence connected to the land. This highlights all the pieces in the Bible that speak to God's care for creation, themes like environmental stewardship, the earth is the Lord's, and all of the for God so loved the world, the cosmos. I mean, these are big themes. So here's another piece here. So driving here this morning, the rental car that I was upgraded to a car that had satellite radio. I don't normally listen to satellite radio, but it gave me the opportunity to test out some things that I've got a few articles here that I'd like to just highlight for you before we have some back and forth. But a lot of the studies, there's this article here just on Saturday in the Star Tribune. It says, you're right, but do you know why you think so? And I found it really interesting and this is nothing new to me, but just to highlight here, when I'm going through satellite radio, I can tune in to any voice that reinforces where I want to come from and listen only to that. Some of the people on both the right and the left on the radio spectrum have almost universal listenership from people that agree with them. And it's increasingly the case on radio, on television, with cable and access, to be able to handpick where you get your news from. This is at the same time, there's a whole lot of news out there. And you can start search the internet and know what is helpful or not, or what's accurate or not. But newspapers are losing their stature. They are cutting down on their reporters. The public coverage of what's going on at the state capitol is just a pittance of what it used to be when I started back in 1995. So this piece right here, he talks about when we listen mostly to people who already agree with us, we get more confident, more unified, and more extreme. Well, there's certain things that are feeding this back and forth right now, I think, in our culture. And I found it very interesting to go from one side of the political spectrum to the other, just in the short drive here this morning, and listening to talk radio, and just was buffeted. And I'll say that one of the best things for me in testing out how I think is that I'm in church basements all the time. And in talking about things that are political, that are policy related, you go right into the lion's nest, or lion's lair, so to speak. Because we're not used to in much of our culture of talking in a civil manner about this. When I go across the street to the state capitol, I know that over the 17 years I've been doing this, that it's all about relationship. And that's you as a constituent too. If you flame that relationship with your elected leader, they're not likely going to listen to you in the way that you'd like them to represent you and listen to you. Same is true of advocacy. I'm working on both sides of the aisle in a nonpartisan manner, and I really want to stress that, in a nonpartisan manner, to move policy that is in the public good, and also the basis from which I speak are our Lutheran church's social statements, like on economic life, on environmental stewardship, on the whole human rights issue. There's a whole spectrum. You can go to the website, and there are like a dozen of them. There's just a new one on criminal justice they're working on right now. There's one on education. There's one on healthcare. Commend those to you. They're great study documents for your congregations. They're great topics. They're broken down in the way for study. But the research from this article right here is basically testing people. If you were to, say, get a group from this room, and I'm sure we're covering the spectrum here in this room, Lutherans are kind of right down the middle from an ideological or political perspective, about 50-50 Democrat and Republican, for example. If we were to take people in this room and say, okay, everyone who agrees with you on one side of the aisle, go to this room and talk about, let's say, climate change, health care, and gay rights. So you go over there and talk about that. This group do the same thing, and you're on the other side. What this study shows is that at the end of that lengthy conversation, people will come out more hardened in their positions and less likely to engage. And this is a lot of research around that particular piece. It's telling us basically that we need to engage in dialogue with people that are not like ourselves and where we're coming from. A lot of the work that I do, both with elected leaders and their constituents, in many ways being a broker. We had a meeting with Senator Senjum at the Synod office. And I'll give this example and then I'll throw it open to some questions here. We had a meeting with Senator Senjum at the very end of the legislative session. We had a great meeting last year with him as well. He's an ELCA Lutheran. And he closed our meeting with a prayer when we met. And these are issues of concern to people on both sides of the aisle. But what was really interesting in that meeting is how we talked for an hour, and you were part of that, Jason. We talked for an hour in a tone that is almost absent from the public square. And on some points we agreed to disagree. On other points we found some very helpful insights on the policies that we were working on. In some cases he said, yes, I'll support that, on a number of cases. Let me give you one example. There was a policy at the time, this last session, we're talking about preserving a viable safety net. And there was a whole flurry of proposals around welfare reform or services like everything from food stamps or SNAP to cash benefits to health benefits and so forth. The things that support people in this recession right now, especially when those needs are going up, more people are out of work and so forth. And so the need is increased. And there was this effort to make sure that that money was going to people that needed it. And so there were efforts to do things like require criminal background checks of everyone receiving public assistance or food stamps. To require drug testing for people that are receiving those benefits. And if they were found to have, say, a criminal background, this is not even a felony, but a misdemeanor, they would be disqualified for their lifetime from receiving those benefits. Now, ultimately, in conversations with lawmakers, I was in the first committee hearing at the state capitol where I testified. It was on Ash Wednesday. And it was the sergeant of arms that broke down basically ushered people that were protesting and everything. That was not us. But there were people that were up in arms at that meeting about this policy, and there were some that were saying, you know, we should ask all the legislators to pee in a cup. You know, if we're going to have the screen for public benefits, you know, let's let that threshold be there for every one of us. And it was interesting at the second hearing, which was with Representative Abler's committee in the House, that it was actually the author of those amendments that after some very good back and forth, after I testified and others, that he withdrew the amendments. And the Senate, of which Senator Senjum is a member, even though they had several bills along the same line, the same track, did not take it up in their policy. And something that a lot of people, the focus at the legislature was on health and human, was on the stadium, it was on, all these other things that were, but the Health and Human Services bill this year passed, I think it was unanimously or pretty darn close to it. That is almost unheard of. And so ultimately we were able to move away from those, and there were some good reforms in there, not everything we liked, but some of the worst things that we were trying to stop, we were successful in stopping, and folks like Senator Senjum was also saying this isn't where we need to be going, and that was part, his faith and others, that this is where we can find a common ground. In today's Star Tribune, Lori Studevant about the inability, an article, How Do We Break Down Our Walls? The inability of average Americans to comfortably talk with one another about civic matters is depleting something fundamental to democracy. It's a full article on that. This is popcorn all throughout the media, just driving here. If you heighten your awareness and start looking about this, you'll see it everywhere. People are really hungering for a more substantive policy debate. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll open it up to some questions. I know you had one, sir, in the back.
Well,
And
before we get to
you
the
can-
questions, we're doing some taping, we've upgraded the sound system, and if we use the mic for the question, we'll pick it up on the video.
Perfect.
So, Jim.
And we can go back and forth the rest of the time here. I'd like to respond more to what you have questions for me on this.
well, you talked about clean energy.
Yes.
And so, speaking as, well, let me just first start by saying only Nixon could go to China. Only probably a Democrat, Bill Clinton, whether you believe in NAFTA or not, but only a Democrat, Bill Clinton, probably could have passed NAFTA.
Mm-hmm.
So let me just talk a little bit about, did you at all talk about nuclear energy? Because I have never ever heard a single person state that, even people who are vehemently opposed to nuclear energy, I've never heard anyone state that there's any way to get to the kind of energy needs we need with, and at the same time reduce emissions without nuclear energy.
It's an excellent question.
Let me just kind of,
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people say, well, for example, and I think that kind of discussion needs to be informed by facts. A lot of people say, I wouldn't want to live near a nuclear power plant because of the radiation exposure. So, just a fact. This is from the American Association of Nuclear Physicists or something.
Mm-hmm.
If you live within 50 miles of a coal-fired power plant, your radiation exposure as a result of living near that power plant is 3 times higher than your radiation exposure from living near a nuclear power plant. Both are infinitesimal, by the way. But it seems to me that there's a discussion that's lacking out there on that topic. And the reason I talked about only Nixon could go to China is that I consider myself a political progressive. I suspect most of the people who agree with me politically, or many people at least, including people who are very concerned about global warming, are vehemently opposed to nuclear power. So, did you guys talk about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Let me demonstrate in how I respond to it some of the breadth of how our office and is trying to foster some dialogue on this. The Lutheran Church is in favor of moving towards cleaner energy. It's like, who wants dirty energy? And our policies do not dictate what that path will be, say. We say it is urgent to reduce our carbon pollution. And to do so, that's a definite concern. But the path to get there is not prescriptive. Meaning, some environmental organizations will say, we are totally opposed to nuclear power. I have never said that in my work, okay? If you've got an even playing field and you look at the different energy options, right now in Minnesota, nuclear power utilities are not calling for more nuclear power. It's the most expensive and highly subsidized form of energy out there. Now, that's not to say there aren't ways to, I don't want to get into the real particulars of energy, but let's just say one of the policy analysts that we work with when we do these events with Polar Explorer, Will Steger, who brings his eyewitness account of what he's seeing globally, both through satellite and his expeditions all over the world, is that we don't need there's not a single silver bullet. It's not nuclear that's going to get us to this 80% reduction by 2050, if that's the path we need to. It's silver buckshot. It's all of the above. It's different forms. And what's the cheapest form of energy? The energy we don't use. There is huge potential there in the energy we don't use, in conservation. In my own life, just for example, I live in St. Paul, and we got one of those old boilers in the basement replaced, got a 95% efficiency boiler and a sidearm water heater that also is at 95% efficiency. The vents for it are made out of plastic or PVC. That's how efficient it is. There's very little heat lost in the system. We did an energy audit of our home, and we insulated it. And we put all of our work into, we intend to stay there. And we were able, through some of the local organizations that we work with, to get a 0% interest loan to do that, to make it workable for us. I think, your question is to energy. I guess I would say I don't really address that in my work. It's one of the options, and we need to get there. And it right now is part of the solution. I was just up in the Iron Range where Bishop Tom Aiken spoke to the public utilities. They had Minnesota Power up there, and they're looking at what to do with some of the oldest coal plants in our state. I think over 80% of their electrical generation up there is from old coal sources. And I sat next to a person from the utilities, from Minnesota Power, and we were talking between speakers and during the breaks and so forth. We both agreed that's unsustainable. In this economy, you want to diversify your energy sources. You don't want to rely all on one type. And so there's a lot of common ground. I think of the first congregation I served in Lake Lillian. And I don't want the whole thing on energy, but I'm going to give this one other example. I went back and did a workshop on, and I preached on environmental stewardship. But I was able to highlight what that congregation had done in Lake Lillian. They sent 8 people to a training we did out in that area. They merged the 2 Lutheran congregations, the Swedes and Norwegians. They actually got together in this group. Now, how many Lutherans does it take to change a light bulb? Change? But their energy bill, they combined the 2 congregations, and they took the stained glass from the one, and it's now in the gathering space for the one congregation. And they've now got different heating zones that are accessible. One of our big debates when I was there was about, do we need an elevator? Well, they've addressed that. And they're now doing all these innovative things relative to energy, and they've got a lower energy bill with that one congregation than both of the congregations combined. And they can look at the bottom line and see, hey, this is good, regardless of where we are on climate change, this is a good way to go. Yes, follow.
So the sermon this morning talked about not always having to have the last word.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to do that, but I am going to say, except to say that I think that if we're going to have these discussions, we need to talk about specifics.
Yeah.
Just as you've done, and as I tried to do as well. And actually, I'd be really interested if somebody here has a different opinion on the topic I raised, or we can talk about something else too.
Well, I on that particular issue, I toured the Prairie Island nuclear plant with Bishop Mark Hansen when he was Bishop of St. Paul Area Synod. Had a full tour of the facility, met with some of the area congregations. I'm very familiar with the issue. And when I turn on the air conditioner, I know that some of my power may be coming from there when it's 100 degrees out. So.
And another question.
Another question. Thank you for that. Oh, surely.
Can I ask?
Yep.
Mark, you've been at this a long time and working with the legislature, and you know, it does seem as though there is a lot more polarization on even the, you know, a basic kind of floor for those who are most in need.
Mm-hmm.
How have you seen that change? And I mean, you give the example that Health and Human Services bill this year passed unanimously, but has that gotten harder? And has that made your work harder to kind of navigate between a kind of hyper polarized political system?
You know, I don't think there's a golden age in political discourse in our country's history. That I can harken back saying, boy, when I started in '95, this was... You know, but I will say I will share with you some observations. There used to be potlucks at the Capitol where people from different sides of the aisle would get together. This happened at the national level too, where people actually got together socially. And they knew one another, and these social relationships still exist across the aisle. I'm not saying they're not there, but there's a lot less of it. And I'm seeing more and more that in order to put forward a position, someone has to vilify the opposition, as opposed to just stating what you're in favor of. And we see that through the negative ads. I find my work with constituents to be what helps me from becoming cynical in this work. That being said, because I sense a real longing in folks toward a better way of doing things on both sides of the aisle, and a frustration. There are those, you know, I go to deer camp every year at my farm near Richland Center, Wisconsin, and I get together with people that are of very different political persuasions, card-carrying NRA people and Tea Partyists on one end and hard-driving Naderites on the other end. You know what I mean? So you're talking the whole spectrum. The difference there is the relationship. I've been hunting with the same crew for over 30 years. We grew up on the same block, a lot of us. We can talk. Oh, I find it so refreshing to be able to be there in that setting and talk politics, to talk religion, to talk all of these things in a meaningful and in a deep way. One of the things I've observed at the state capitol is a lot of the moderates, the people that are willing to work across the aisle to forge bipartisan legislative solutions to problems, to look beyond the next election to the next generation. That a lot of those moderates have, I would say both parties in some ways have been purged, are not there. And I grieve their loss. I can name 20 of them who I regularly could go and meet with, who were always the brokers between the parties who could work towards a compromise. And let me just give an example. I'll shoot to the federal level, because there's an alert right now from and we're sending it out this weekend on the Farm Bill. And the Farm Bill is reauthorized every 5 years. And it's looking right now that none of the spending bills at the national level are going to get resolved. None of them. This is the second year running. I mean, things are really stuck. And there is this fiscal cliff that neither side wants in 2013, in January, where sequestration goes into effect, and it's across the board. Everything from domestic to defense spending gets whacked. And they're saying, we got to come up with a solution. But I was listening on public radio right now, and I was listening on Fox Radio. I was going back and forth, and I was going to you know, just around the dial here. And this was where the discussion was. And there's this paralysis of being able to work on this.
Can you highlight some of why the Farm Bill is so important to issues of poverty and hunger? Because we're all pretty much city dwellers.
The Farm Bill is a misnomer. It should be named the Food Bill. It's really of concern to everyone who eats. Okay. 80%, I believe, of the nutrition programs, just food stamps or what's now called SNAP, and other nutrition, key school lunch and all these important nutrition programs, that's about 80% of the Farm Bill. And people don't know that. They think, oh, it's about farming and, you know, bailing out wealthy farmers, or, you know, I mean, all of the different things on there. But it's about disaster, dealing with disasters that, like where our farm is in Wisconsin, it's almost a total loss. The fields are brown. The corn wasn't even tasseling this summer. Soybeans we planted didn't even come up. I mean, it's miserable. And so farmers are on that hard, and having served in rural congregations, they're in that hard place. So the Farm Bill is really critical for, as for the farm community. They need to know with economic security how to plant and how to plan for the next year, but not just that, for the next bunch of years. That's why a Farm Bill is important, and they're in this limbo right now. And the Farm Bill passed in the Senate with a strong bipartisan vote. It also passed in the House out of committee on a strong bipartisan vote. The problem is it's being held up, many would say, both sides would say, by politics. And so it's looking more and more like the Farm Bill will not get out of see the light of day, so to speak, before it expires. The implications are that sequestration will dictate where a lot of these cuts happen, rather than necessarily working across the aisle in a way that it's a mandatory, just even-handed across the board. Does that serve our country well? Does that serve farmers well? Does that serve people that are hungry well? I think we can do better than that. Yeah. And so there's an alert that if you sign up to this piece, it will be going out probably tomorrow, about before the National Congress adjourns. They're not even going to work. It's looking like much in October, if at all, which they were planning on doing, but it's looking like they're just going to get out. And it's to basically urge that they look and pass a farm bill, bring it to a vote, and do it in a way that serves the common good. So there's a lot on the Farm Bill. It's a huge piece, but.
Anybody else? Questions? Okay.
I appreciate your comments, and it leads me to a very simple but obvious question.
Mm-hmm.
If so many people long for conversation and moderation, what keeps us from doing it?
I would welcome others to answer that. I do find, this is, you know how polarized in some ways the whole issue of say, climate change has become. It used to be, as I say, passed overwhelmingly in 2007 with very bipartisan support at the state legislature, a lot of bills addressing those issues. We had a meeting, we had these events with Will Steger up in Grand Rapids and Princeton last December. We had 45 minutes where I moderated back and forth questions, and it was this type of conversation. It was really, people were not all on the same page, but we had a civil conversation. I think the church can be one of those places where that can happen and needs to happen. Sometimes the church enters in as a wedge. And I think we need to be very careful. I think enter with humility when we say our faith tells us it is so. Because you can look throughout history and see where we thought that was the case, where people on both sides of the aisle say on a lot of the issues, from everything from slavery to women's right to vote to the civil rights movement, use their faith on both sides of the political spectrum and ended up eating crow. or becoming very bitter and more divided. I mean, the whole history of politics is such. So I think there needs to be a sense of humility and a sense of grace that infuses the whole process. We've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. I think there's...
In connection with that, if you did not get a chance yet to sign up to get updates on these issues from the Lutheran Coalition, did everybody get a chance to put your name on that? No? Up through here? Up here? Okay.
And I'll stick around for a while. After this, we've got a couple more minutes. Other lingering questions? You know, let me just say one thing here. I just pulled this out, you know, right now, the House, which is not passing the Farm Bill right now or any of the budget stuff, that into effect beginning January 3rd, there will be $1.2 trillion in cuts to be made equally across defense and domestic programs over the next decade. Right now, the House right now passed legislation Thursday that would shift the burden completely onto domestic programs. You know, it's this poll. Is it completely? Is it one or the other? And in particular, food stamps, school lunches, and other programs to spare defense spending, which is part of this both and thing. It's kind of this either or piece that we're seeing and the moderates that I worked with over many years were willing to kind of, well, this side believes this, let's find maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. Or maybe where we need to go is just because we gotta govern here.
One more question here.
I don't really have a question. I just want to comment on your metaphor of being the leaven for the crumbling loaf. And I think that's really an excellent image for us to have. I plan to think of that regularly on all kinds of issues, moderation, but to have the church be the leaven in your work.
Thank you very much. Let me state there's the Lutheran Church joined many other faith leaders in this what's called Circle of Protection, which is a statement on why we need programs to protect the poor, things like SNAP or food stamps and other anti-poverty pieces. And there was a video released, 3-minute video on both from Mitt Romney and Obama that addressed specifically what they would do in their administrations to address the deepening poverty in our country, in our nation. And Jason, I commend to you, has a piece where it's got links, it's got a click, you can, a link on that to the statement by Bishop Mark Hansen that talks about our denomination's commitment to this. But also, in particular here, very helpful, this in no way implies any endorsement of either candidate or, you know, this is their own voice addressing this question, which is through Circle of Protection, which is basically saying, circle the wagons around the basic floor of dignity that people that are in this rough economy find themselves.
If I could just have one kind of piggyback on that, I think one of the questions that I have is, okay, so what can we do? And it's encouraging the Circle of Protection and some of your work, a lot of your work being done. You know, faith community is having a direct impact on how policy is being carried out, and I think it's a real testament to this. I think it's a group of 58 different denominations and faith-based organizations that's created this Circle of Protection, who have encouraged and actually gotten both presidential candidates to address directly what poverty, what they would do about poverty, and so you know, we may sit here as individuals wondering, well, what can we do? And I think, you know, Mark obviously has given us some action items, but know that I think we are playing a role as people of faith, and we're called to that. You know, there's something about that. It's not to you know, grab our political flags, but to really examine where we come from as people of faith and what God has to say about all people, and figure out where does that send us, where does that lead us.
And if I may conclude with one thought here. You know, your question about, you know, nuclear or coal, you know, some people would say this is the solution. I think your question was really well phrased in that regard. And relative to dealing with hunger, since some of our funding comes from the hunger work of this church. The cuts right now that are being proposed, right now in SNAP, food stamps, it would take, this is some calculations that Bread for the World has done on this, and I think they came up with $50,000 per congregation to fill that hole, that pothole. So you think of the role of charity and the role of government in addressing hunger. And the video that we didn't show is Bob Dole and George McGovern, and the story about how they worked across the aisle with Barry Goldwater and all sorts of unlikely people that worked together to coming back from the war, seeing hunger and poverty up close and saying we don't have this in our country, and forging the food stamp program, which has been bipartisan all along. And it is simply not within the capacity of the faith community to fill this pothole, nor should it be. Just the people in faith. This is part of our, so we're not advocating, well, it's a government solution, it's a faith community. It's got to be silver buckshot, so to speak. It's got to be all working together.
Mark, we thank you for the time you spent, and our prayers go with you as you continue this terribly important ministry. And thanks for coming. Mark has brought a great supply of materials, and we don't want to let him go back with all of that home. Help yourself. And this was part 1. Jason, just a brief pitch on part 2.
Sure.
And please pray for me. I'm going to be listening to satellite radio.
All the way to Vermilion. Just a heads up, we've talked a little bit about state level. I think next week we will address some of the work that's been done globally through the Millennium Development Goals that were put together by the UN, and how faith-based organizations have addressed that. We'll also talk a little bit about what we as a congregation are currently doing and can do to continue to advocate for support for hunger and poverty in our own community. And so we may even take a look at that McGovern and Dole video next week, because it's fascinating. And so come back, hope you'll join us. Thanks again, Mark, for being here.